It starts slowly. A missed phone call here, a postponed lunch there. Then, before you realize it, weeks turn into months, and the voices that once filled your days become echoes of the past. Friends relocate, family members get busy, and life, as it always does, keeps moving forward, even when it feels like you're standing still. Aging brings many changes, and one of the hardest is watching people drift away. The circle that once felt so full begins to shrink, leaving behind a quiet that can feel more like a void than a comfort. But solitude doesn't have to be a sentence to loneliness. It can be a passage to self-discovery, a chance to cultivate new connections, and an opportunity to embrace life on your own terms. This is a story about finding strength in solitude, learning to let go without losing yourself, and discovering that even in the quiet, life still hums with possibility. Margaret sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. The chair across from her, James' chair, remained empty, just as it had for the past 3 years. It used to be filled with his laughter, his gentle teasing, his presence. Now, it was just a reminder of absence. At first, people visited often. Her daughter called every day, her book club friends checked in, and the neighbors made small talk over the fence. But slowly, as time moved forward, so did they. The calls became less frequent, the visits turned into holiday obligations, and the book club eventually disbanded. Margaret understood. Life was like the tide, people came and went. Still, the silence in the house was sometimes unbearable. She had two choices: let the loneliness swallow her whole or learn to make peace with it. She chose the latter. Margaret began with small steps. She woke up early, stretched her stiff limbs, and brewed her morning coffee with intention. She started journaling. At first, just a few words each day, but soon, pages filled with thoughts, memories, and hopes. She rediscovered old passions. Painting, which she had abandoned years ago, became a solace. She bought a set of watercolors and let the brush glide over the canvas, letting her emotions bleed into the hues. Then, she pushed herself further. She joined a local walking group for seniors, where she met Evelyn, a feisty woman with a quick wit and a love for gardening. Their conversations started slow, but soon they were meeting for lunch and exchanging books. She also found unexpected companionship in technology. Her grandson, Nathan, introduced her to video calls and social media. At first, it felt foreign, but soon she was exchanging messages with an old college friend she hadn't spoken to in decades. One evening, as Margaret sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized something profound. She was no longer waiting for the phone to ring. She had become her own best company. Loneliness still visited occasionally, like an old acquaintance who overstayed their welcome, but it no longer consumed her. She had found ways to fill her days with meaning, through art, through friendship, through small joys like a good book and a warm cup of tea. Aging wasn't about fading away, it was about evolving. Life had changed, but that didn't mean it had lost its beauty. She smiled to herself, picked up her paintbrush, and began a new canvas, one filled with color, life, and the quiet peace of a soul that had learned to stand steady, even as the world drifted around her. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret received a letter in the mail. Not a bill, not a flyer, an actual letter. The handwriting was familiar but slightly shakier than she remembered. Dear Margaret, it's been far too long. I hope this letter finds you well. I was cleaning out some old boxes and found a photo of us from our college days, laughing, carefree, and full of plans. It made me think of you. I know life has taken us in different directions, but I'd love to see you again. There's a small gathering at the community center next Sunday. Come if you can. It would mean the world to me. Warmly, Claire. Margaret stared at the letter, a mixture of emotions rising in her chest. Claire. Her best friend from university. They had once been inseparable, but life, as it often does, had pulled them apart. Careers, marriages, children, moves, so many excuses, and now decades had passed. She hesitated. It had been years since she had stepped into a social setting like this. Would they still have anything to talk about? Would Claire even recognize the woman Margaret had become? But then she remembered her promise to herself. She would not let solitude turn into isolation. She placed the letter on her kitchen table and smiled. She would go. The community center was alive with chatter and laughter when Margaret arrived. At first, she lingered near the entrance, scanning the room. Then she saw her, Claire, sitting at a round table, her silver hair swept into a familiar bun, her eyes bright with recognition. "Margaret!" Claire exclaimed, standing up and wrapping her in a warm embrace. In an instant, the years melted away. They fell into conversation as if no time had passed, swapping stories about their children, their husbands, their travels. They laughed about the foolish things they had done in their youth, reminisced about the professors they had adored and the ones they had loathed, and shared the ways life had surprised them. The loneliness Margaret had been feeling for so long seemed like a distant memory. She wasn't just remembering who she used to be, she was reconnecting with a part of herself that she had thought was lost. As the afternoon wore on, Claire leaned in conspiratorially. "You know, a few of us are taking an art class together on Thursdays. You should join." Margaret hesitated for only a second before she nodded. "I'd love to." Weeks passed, and Margaret found herself busier than she had been in years. The art class was a delight. Each session was filled with laughter, creativity, and encouragement. She made new friends, each of them carrying their own stories of love, loss, and resilience. She started inviting people over for tea, something she hadn't done since James passed. She even hosted a small gathering for her birthday, a quiet affair but one filled with warmth and conversation. Most importantly, she had stopped waiting. She no longer measured her worth by who reached out first, nor did she dwell on the friendships that had faded. Instead, she nurtured the ones that remained and welcomed the new ones that came into her life. One evening, as she sat by the window, watching the golden hues of sunset stretch across the sky, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Contentment. Solitude had not been her enemy, it had been her teacher. It had shown her resilience, self-love, and the quiet beauty of her own company. And now, with old friendships rekindled and new adventures ahead, she was ready for whatever life had in store. The world hadn't drifted away from her. She had simply found her own way back to it. Winter settled in, wrapping the town in a hush of white snow and crisp air. Margaret's days were no longer empty. They were filled with painting, laughter, and the warmth of rekindled friendships. Yet, despite her newfound contentment, there were still quiet evenings when the house felt just a little too silent, and the absence of James lingered like a shadow. One evening, just as she was setting her book aside to head to bed, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Glancing at the clock, 9:12 p.m., she hesitated. Slowly, she made her way to the door and peeked through the peephole. A young man stood outside, shifting nervously from foot to foot, his hood pulled up against the cold. Margaret unlocked the door but kept the chain in place. "Yes?" The young man looked up, his face barely illuminated by the porch light. "Hi." He paused, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'm sorry to bother you so late. I think you knew my grandfather. James Calloway." Margaret's heart stopped. She fumbled with the chain, opening the door wide. "James Calloway was my husband." The young man swallowed hard, then offered a small, hesitant smile. "I know. My name's Aaron. I'm his grandson." Margaret's mind spun. James had never mentioned a grandson named Aaron. She only knew of Nathan, her daughter's boy. I don't understand." Aaron exhaled, his breath shaky. "I only found out recently. My mom, she and my grandfather lost touch years ago. But when I turned 18, I started digging, trying to learn more about where I came from. That's how I found you." Margaret blinked, emotions swirling too fast to process. "Come inside," she said softly. As Aaron stepped over the threshold, shaking the snow off his boots, Margaret felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just the weight of the past pressing in, it was the unmistakable sense that her life, once again, was about to change. Over steaming cups of cocoa, Aaron told his story. His mother, Claire, not Margaret's old friend, but another Claire, had been born long before James had met Margaret. He had fathered a child when he was young, but for reasons Margaret would never fully understand, he and Claire's mother had gone separate ways. James had never spoken of it. Not once. Margaret listened, a storm of emotions rising inside her. Anger, for the secrets James had kept. Sadness, for the daughter he had lost. And heartbreak, for the years that had slipped through their fingers. I don't want anything from you, Aaron said gently. I just wanted to know him. And when I couldn't, I thought maybe I could know you. Margaret looked into his eyes, so much like James. And in that moment, the past, with all its regrets and mysteries, no longer felt like something she needed to fight. She reached across the table and placed a hand over Aaron's. Then let's start there. In the weeks that followed, Margaret and Aaron built something neither of them had expected, a bond that defied time, loss, and the fractures of the past. She told him about James, not as the absent figure he had long wondered about, but as the man who had filled her life with love and laughter. She showed him photographs, old letters, even James' favorite worn-out sweater that still hung in the closet. And in return, Aaron brought his own stories. Of his mother, of his childhood, of the pieces of James that still lived on through him. One snowy afternoon, they visited James' grave together. Margaret stood silently, the wind biting at her cheeks, as Aaron placed a single white lily against the stone. I wish I had known him, Aaron murmured. Margaret squeezed his shoulder. You do now. He nodded, and for the first time, Margaret felt something in her heart settle. She had spent so long fearing solitude, fearing the way people drifted away. But now she understood, sometimes, even when you lose people, love finds a way to bring you back to them. Spring arrived with a quiet warmth. Margaret's house, once filled with silence, was now alive with laughter, conversation, and the smell of fresh paint. Aaron had taken up painting too. On the walls of Margaret's home now hung a new canvas, one they had painted together. A landscape of a golden field, a lone tree in the center, its branches reaching toward a sky painted with endless hues of blue. A tree with deep roots, just like the love that bound them, across generations, across time. And Margaret, who once thought she had lost everything, now realized she had gained something even greater, a future she never saw coming. Margaret's days took on a new rhythm, one she never expected at this stage of life. Afternoons with Aaron, painting together in comfortable silence. Evenings spent sharing stories, piecing together the fragments of James' past. They had become family, not by blood alone, but by choice. But life, as Margaret had learned, always had more surprises in store. One Sunday morning, as she finished setting the table for breakfast, 2 cups, 2 plates, a habit she had formed now that Aaron visited so often, there was a knock at the door. Not the usual light tap of Evelyn, her walking companion. Not the playful pounding Aaron sometimes did when he arrived. This was different. Measured. Unfamiliar. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. A woman stood there. Older than Aaron, perhaps in her 40s, with tired eyes and a hesitant expression. Margaret didn't have to ask who she was. The resemblance to James was undeniable. Margaret Calloway. The woman's voice was steady, but something wavered beneath it. Margaret's heart pounded. Yes. The woman inhaled sharply, as if steadying herself for what came next. My name is Claire, she said. I'm James' daughter. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt her knees weaken, but she gripped the doorframe and nodded slowly. Come in. As she stepped aside, Margaret realized something. For years, she had been mourning the people she lost. But now, in the most unexpected way, they were coming back to her. The past wasn't done with her yet. And neither was life. Claire sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken words. Aaron arrived moments later, stopping in his tracks at the sight of his mother. His expression flickered between shock and hope. You came, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, her hands wrapped around the mug of tea Margaret had placed in front of her. I didn't know if I should, she admitted. But I had to know. Margaret studied her. This was James' daughter, a woman he had kept hidden in his past, for reasons she might never fully understand. But as she looked at her now, at the lines on her face, at the pain she carried, Margaret saw something familiar. Loneliness. Claire had been abandoned too, in a way. Forgotten. Left to navigate a world where she had no answers. Just like Margaret had. For the first time in her life, Margaret found herself not asking why. But what now? She reached across the table, the same way she had done with Aaron weeks ago, and placed a hand over Claire's. Tell me everything, Margaret said. Tell me what I never knew. And so Claire did. She spoke of a father she barely remembered, of the childhood spent wondering why he never came back, of the years she spent resenting him, only to learn later, too late, that he had built another life, a life with Margaret. But there was no anger in her voice now, only sorrow. And maybe, just maybe, the hope of something new. I don't know what I expected coming here, Claire admitted. Maybe closure. Maybe answers. She exhaled, shaking her head. But now, I think, maybe I just wanted to meet you. Margaret felt something shift inside her. A choice. She could close herself off, let the pain of the past form a wall between them. Or she could open the door a little wider. She smiled softly. Then let's not be strangers. And just like that, the world grew a little larger again. Spring gave way to summer, and Margaret's once quiet home was no longer just hers. Claire visited often, cautiously at first, then with more ease. Margaret and Aaron became her bridge to the father she had lost. And though James was gone, his presence was felt in every shared memory, in every story retold over cups of tea and laughter-filled dinners. But Margaret, more than anyone, knew that the past alone couldn't sustain a life. So, they built something new. She and Claire found themselves spending afternoons in the garden, tending to the roses James once loved. Aaron took up carpentry, refurbishing the old wooden chairs on Margaret's porch. And on one golden afternoon, as they all sat together, 3 generations, once strangers, now bound by something deeper, Margaret realized the truth. She had spent so long fearing solitude, believing she had reached the final chapter of her story. But life had given her an unexpected gift. A new beginning. And she wasn't done writing her story yet. The summer days stretched long and golden, and for the first time in years, Margaret's house felt truly alive. It was no longer a place of quiet reflection but of laughter, shared meals, and unexpected reunions. Then, one morning, something arrived that sent a ripple through this newfound peace. A letter. It was tucked in with the usual stack of mail, bills, catalogs, a postcard from Evelyn's vacation in Italy. But this envelope stood out. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly faded. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. The moment she saw the handwriting, she felt the breath leave her lungs. It was from James. Aaron and Claire sat across from Margaret as she held the letter, her fingers tracing the familiar script. "How is this possible?" Aaron asked. Did he write this before he passed?" Margaret swallowed. "It must have been lost in the mail for years." Claire reached out. "Do you want to read it alone?" Margaret shook her head. No more secrets. No more silence. She unfolded the letter, took a steadying breath, and began to read aloud. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then fate has given me one last chance to speak to you. And there's something I've carried for too long, something I should have told you long ago. I had a daughter before I met you. Her name is Claire." Margaret's eyes flicked up to Claire, who sat still, her hands clenched together. "I was young, and I was a coward. I left without knowing what kind of father I could be, and that decision haunts me. I don't know if she hates me. I don't know if she even remembers me. But I want you to know that if I had the chance, I would have done things differently. You have always been my heart, Margaret. My anchor. I never kept this from you out of mistrust. I did it because I was afraid that if I spoke it aloud, the weight of my mistakes would take something from us. If you ever find Claire, tell her I thought of her every day. Tell her I am sorry. And tell her she was always loved. Yours forever, James." Silence filled the room. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. She turned away, staring out the window as if searching for something in the distance. Aaron looked down, absorbing the weight of a grandfather he never met, a story he had only just begun to understand. And Margaret felt a strange kind of peace settle over her. Because now, she knew. James had wanted this. He had longed for this. And somehow, despite the years and the distance, life had brought them all together anyway. The next day, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She took out one of James' old canvases, a large, unfinished painting he had abandoned long ago. It was meant to be a family portrait, but he had never completed it. She set it on the easel, picked up her brush, and for the first time, she knew exactly how to finish it. She painted James first, his warm eyes and kind smile. Then herself, beside him, the way they had always been. And then, With careful strokes, she painted Claire and Aaron, the family that had taken decades to come together. The family that was, finally, whole. As she put down the brush, Margaret exhaled, a soft smile tugging at her lips. This wasn't just a painting. It was proof that love, no matter how delayed, always found its way home. Margaret once feared solitude. Now, she embraced the quiet, knowing it would always be filled again. Her house, once a place of memories, had become a place of new beginnings. And as she stood in front of the finished portrait, surrounded by the family she never knew she needed, she realized something. Her story wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. Margaret sat by the window, staring at the completed portrait. It felt final, yet something in her heart told her the story wasn't finished. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She expected Claire or Aaron, but when she opened it, a stranger stood there. A woman, maybe in her late 30s, holding an old leather-bound book. Her eyes searched Margaret's face, filled with something between hesitation and hope. "I'm sorry to show up like this," the woman said, her voice uncertain. "But I think James Calloway was my father." Margaret's breath caught. Not again. Not another secret. The woman held out the book. "I found this in my mother's things after she passed. It's filled with letters he wrote but never sent." Margaret's hands trembled as she took it. Inside, in James' familiar handwriting, were words meant for yet another lost child. Another piece of his past. Another mystery waiting to be unraveled. Margaret looked up at the woman, her heart pounding. "Come in," she said. And just like that, the past knocked on her door once more.